this beautiful home. She found it was surrounded by orchards, centred in the Napa Valley, and you can still visit this house today. I visited it when we made Keepers of the Flame. And I'm going to show you a few rooms in this house because it's furnished today just as Ellen White left it. And this home was the home where she was to spend the last 15 years of her life. Have a look at some of the furnishings if you're interested, because this has been left just as Ellen White left it. There's a dining room there, or a lounge room rather, and she loved around that fire, and she met morning and evening with her workers in worship and sang wonderful hymns there with the organ that's there, though she never played the organ herself. There's another picture, and the picture there is just of the same room, and the two chairs in the corner, as it were the chairs that Ellen White used as she led out in worship in that home. Upstairs is her writing room, and that little chair surrounded by windows was the place where she delighted to sit in the sun. It was surrounded by the windows and brought in the sunshine, and many, many times she sat there writing out the visions that God gave her when she was here in this house. There's a closer view of that, and I was interested to discover that the only piece of furniture that Ellen White took from Australia across to her home in California was that board. You can just see it there. She called it a lapboard because she would write out the visions that the Lord gave her on that little piece of timber. And that's the only piece of furniture she took from Australia back to New Zealand. The dining room where she entertained guests, and her bedroom. I remember hearing from Mrs. White's granddaughter, because my wife and I visited this home one Sabbath afternoon that was even colder than it is here in Crosslands. And it was a blustery day and wet, and nobody else turned up that afternoon, but who should be the guide to lead us through that home was Mrs. White's granddaughter. And she told us some wonderful stories of her memories of her grandmother, and what a kind and loving grandmother she was. And one of the stories that I heard that day was that you see the window that's there. If you look through that window, up on the hill, some distance away, is our Adventist hospital, the St. Helena Sanitarium. And one day, there were people early in the morning looking down at Ellen White's house, and they noticed a tremendously bright glow of light coming through that window. And it was such an extraordinary, it wasn't just light from an electric light, it was real brilliant bright light. And they came to Ellen White during the day and they said, "Did something happen last night? Did you receive a vision from the Lord?" And she said, "Oh yes," she said, "Jesus himself came to visit me that night." And here it made a deep impression on those people as they looked down and saw the brilliant light that was shining from this window. There it's furnished with photographs of pioneers on the furniture, and that on the little table there. But I'm interested in that over there, because let me bring that up a little bit closer. Do you know what that is? She put it in her bedroom when she came back from Australia, because it was it's really a picture, but it's all made of Australian flowers made out of feathers. And when she left Australia at Kurrambong, the believers, the church members there, gave her that picture, if I could put it that way, to remind her of the Australian feather flowers, and yet it was made of feathers. And she went back to Australia, from Australia to America, and she put that in her bedroom, she says, to remind her of her visit to Australia. She didn't want to come to Australia initially because it was crossing the sea, and in those days crossing the Pacific was a pretty long journey. She felt she wanted to get on and do her writing in America, but she felt the Lord was leading her and calling her to come to Australia, and so she came. It's interesting that she said, "I don't ever want to leave Australia." She said, "I'm happy to die in this country." But the Lord gave her a vision and said, "You are needed back in America," because the church was going to face some very great crises in the 1900s, which it did, and her presence there was a great blessing to the church. She was buried in Battle Creek in Michigan, and this is the entrance to the little Oak Hill Cemetery. And if you ever visit Oak Hill Cemetery, there's the grave of the White family. And not only Ellen White is buried there, her husband James, her sons. She had 2 surviving sons, Willie White and James Edson White. They both became ministers of the gospel. And there's another view of this family plot. It's a very moving experience, I must confess, to stand there. I took this photograph of the grave. And you know, I'm always thankful that the church did not make the mistake of building a great mausoleum or a great, cement memorial of the grave of Ellen White and her husband. It is just a simple marker. Look at it. Mother, Ellen G. White, and father, James White. When she was living in her home in California, just north of San Francisco, after she returned from Australia, on Sabbath afternoon she would often go out, and there's a photograph taken of her with her secretary. They would go out and visit in the surrounding district. Now, the home then and the home today is surrounded by one of America's leading wine growing areas. Hundreds of acres of grapes growing for wine. And it was in Ellen White's day. How did Ellen White, as she went out Sabbath afternoon, she would be driven down and there she'd see some wine growers picking grapes to make wine. How would Ellen White, the prophet of God, who condemned alcohol and said it's not good for us, how would she relate to the men who were working the grapes to make the wine? After she died, the people in that district, the wine growers, said this about Ellen White: "We will always remember the little old lady who always spoke so lovingly of whom?" She could have condemned them, rebuked them, told them that you weren't doing the right thing to make grapes into wine. What did she speak about? Jesus. Jesus. I think that there would be no better accolade made of any of us after we've passed away than he or she always spoke so lovingly of Jesus. But she was also a woman of prayer. I don't know any of you, do you recognise the man who's on the screen? Anybody tell me his name? Yes, Pastor Joe. HMS Richards. He was a man who started the radio work for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the world. Wonderful man. My wife and I had the privilege of having him and his wife in our home some years ago. Very godly man. Read the Bible through twice every year. Once, January, February, March, he would put aside all other magazines and books and only read the Bible through once, January, February, March. From April down to December, he would read it much more slowly again. And I have never heard any Adventist preacher fill his sermons with so much scripture as that man. But when he was a boy, about 15 years of age, he went to a camp meeting in Colorado to listen to the prophet, the Adventist Church's prophet speaking. He'd never heard her speak before. And he was a young boy of about 15 years of age. Do you know what he said about Ellen White? Because at the end of her speaking, she invited the people to pray. And he says that he was sitting in the front row and Ellen White was sort of up here. And she knelt, and as she began to pray, he began to hear people in the congregation sobbing, weeping. Because they felt in that prayer that she was lifting that congregation up into the very presence of God. And they became aware of their sinfulness. And he was amazed as he heard these people sobbing, weeping, as they were being brought into the presence of God while she prayed. And this is why Pastor Richards later on wrote this: "When she prayed, it was like being in the presence of God. A deep conviction swept over the audience, and men and women wept. She talked to God as though she knew him." And then notice the last sentence: "I knew she was all she claimed to be when I heard her pray." Pray. That's the fruitage test again, I believe, dear friends. What was she like as a speaker? This is an interesting quotation from a book that was written about the famous men in the state of Michigan. And out of that whole book, they only comment about one woman. And it happened to be this lady. Look at what it says. Mrs. Woman is a woman of singularly well-balanced mental organisation. Benevolence, spirituality, conscientiousness, ideality are the predominating traits. Her personal qualities are just as to win for her the warmest friendship of all with whom she comes in contact, and to inspire them with the utmost confidence in her sincerity. Notwithstanding her many years of public labour, she has retained all the simplicity and honesty that characterised her early life. As a speaker, Mrs. White is one of the most successful of the few ladies who have become noteworthy as lecturers in this country during the past 20 years. When inspired with her subject, she is often marvellously eloquent, holding the largest audiences spellbound for hours without a sign of impatience and weariness. A young girl at 17 years of age who only went to school till 3rd grade. How wonderfully did the Lord lead and bless. But it's not so much in those aspects that I want to mention before I close today. It's the books that she has written that are her legacy to you and to me today. And so many of them focus particularly on Jesus, the desire of ages, the great controversy between Jesus and Satan, Christ's object lessons, the other books like Prophets and Kings and Patriarchs and Prophets. When Ellen White was writing, where did she get the information for her books? Because this is where it is relevant to you and to me today, what we read. Where did she get that information from? I want you to notice what she says about the letters that she wrote to people in her day. Writing to Uriah Smith, that man I mentioned before, she said, "Weak and trembling, I arose at 3 o'clock in the morning to write to you. God was speaking through clay." Remember the testimony of Jesus. You might say that this communication was only a letter. Yes, it was a letter, but prompted by the Spirit of God to bring before your minds things that have been shown to me in vision. In these letters which I write, in the testimonies I bear, I am presenting to you that which the Lord has presented to me. I do not write one article in our paper, that's our church paper that came out every week, expressing merely my own ideas. They are what God has opened before me in vision, the precious rays of light shining before the throne. And then concerning the books that she wrote, I have written many books, and they have been given a wide circulation. Of myself, I could not have brought out the truth in these books, but the Lord has given me the help of his Holy Spirit. These books, giving the instruction that the Lord has given me during the past 60 years, contain light from heaven and will bear the test of investigation. But do those books, dear friends, still speak to us today? Do they? I've met some people, and I'm meeting some people, which disturbs me greatly when they say, well, Ellen White lived 100 years ago here in Australia. She could not possibly speak with any relevance to a world that is so different to what it was 100 years ago. If 100 years ago makes a book irrelevant, what do we do with this book? Do prophets ever go out of date? That's the question I want to ask you this morning. If the Lord is speaking through them, does the Lord not know the future? Can he not speak to your heart and to mine 100 years later? In 1909, Ellen White made this statement: "Abundant light has been given to our people in these last days. Whether or not my life is spared, my writings will constantly speak, and their work will go forward as long," what's it say? "As time shall last." Notice, her work will go forward as long as time shall last. My writings are kept on file in the office, and even though I should not live, these words which have been given me by the Lord will still have life and will speak to the people. Dear friends, can I suggest to you today that they will only speak to people who are willing to hear and listen. If God is speaking through prophets, how important it is that God's people in every age listen to what the prophets are speaking, because the prophets are delivering, remember the text at the beginning, the testimony of Jesus. I want to suggest, as I close today, 4 ways that Ellen White's writings are still relevant today and speak to our hearts. The first one is this one. They are relevant because they continually point us to the Bible and help us to apply its principles to our lives. If one thing has impressed me, dear friends, with all the contact I had with the Ellen White writings, it's how much Ellen White pointed the church continually to the Bible. In fact, she said on one occasion, don't use my writings to prove Bible doctrine, and that's something we should not do. Go to the Bible, because I'm so thankful that our 28 fundamental beliefs are all based upon Scripture. We don't have to go to any of Ellen White's books to prove any doctrine that we believe. Even the cleansing of the sanctuary that we talked about last night, and 1844, and the pre-Advent judgment, and some of these things that have been questioned. I don't need to go to Ellen White's writings to prove them to be true. Or sure, she said a lot about it that says that yes, they are true, but I don't believe them because Ellen White says it. I believe it because it's in the Word of God, and she continually points us to the Bible. Do you know the last words that she ever spoke to the Adventist church in a general conference? That's a time when the representatives come to one place and they meet and make decisions like they're going to do next year. But the last general conference Ellen White ever attended was in 1909. It was held over in Washington, D.C. And she had spoken at that conference all through the week, and then it came to the last Sabbath afternoon. And people flooded into the building, or it was a tent if I remember rightly, to listen to the last words they thought they would ever hear from Ellen White in speaking to the whole church. And she spoke a wonderfully heartwarming sermon that Sabbath afternoon. And then she finished, and she turned and went away from the desk to take her seat behind her. And then halfway across, she returned, and everybody's eyes, knowing this was the last time they would ever hear her speak to the church in session, their eyes were fixed upon her, and they noticed she returned to the desk, and picking up the heavy Bible, as they had in those days, in her shaking 82-year-old hands, she held the Bible high above the people, and the last words she ever spoke to the church were, "Brethren and sisters, I commend to you this book." And that was a fitting statement to make, because that was the whole purpose of her life, commending the Word of God as the basis of our faith. Here's the second reason. They are relevant in the warnings and insight they give us about the future. Dear friends, I said to you before, Jesus said, "I have told you these things before they happen, that when they happen, you may believe." And I just want to remind you that I've written down here that in that book, Great Controversy, that wonderful book, she wrote that in the future there was going to be a union among the churches. Wasn't evident when she wrote that in 1888, when she republished Great Controversy. She spoke about the increasing worldwide influence of the Church of Rome. Wasn't happening back in the 1880s. She spoke about the growing acceptance by Protestantism of the authority of the Church of Rome. And some of you have told me what you saw on television and by video early this year when the Pope sent a special message to the Protestant Pentecostals in America saying, "Come back, there's no more protest among Protestants, come back to Rome and accept Rome as your leader." Early this year, dear friends. The increase in frequency of natural disasters. Have you ever wondered why we're seeing on screen the worst storm, the worst tsunami, the worst earthquake ever to be recorded, the hottest summers, the worst droughts? Way back in 1888, Ellen White said that one of the signs of the soon coming of Jesus, and these are the 2 words she used, the frequency and intensity of natural disasters. natural disasters. She spoke about the destruction of skyscrapers in New York. She spoke about the rise and progress of spiritualism, which is growing at an alarming rate as people claim they can contact the dead. She spoke about the counterfeit speaking in tongues and the increasing influence of Eastern religions, yoga and meditation and other things that are coming from the East. She spoke about the role of the United States in last day events. And dear friends, I'm speaking to people who have seen in the newspapers and on the television of the increasing role of the United States and also of what is happening in its attitude towards Rome. It was in the United States that video was taken when the Pope sent to the Protestants in America, "Come back to Rome." Read what Ellen White says about that in Great Controversy. Well, they are relevant in the insights they give. And look at this picture. Who's that on the left? Well, let's merely say it was the Pope, not the present one, an earlier one few years ago. Who's the man on the right? The President, Bush, not Obama, Bush. Yeah, a bit hard to see in this light, but it's the President of the United States. And this photo was taken of President Bush and the Pope sitting down and talking. And did you know that in September this year, for the first time in history, the Pope is going to speak to the combined houses of Congress in the United States of America? Never happened before. And in September this year, what's happening between America and the papacy? Read Great Controversy, dear friends. It's important that you and I know. When Ellen White wrote the book Great Controversy, published it in 1888 first, she wrote this: "While writing the manuscript of Great Controversy, I was often conscious of the presence of the angels of God, and many times the scenes about which I was writing were presented to me anew in visions of the night, so that they were fresh and vivid in my mind." That's a very special book, dear friends. She said on one occasion, "I value the book Great Controversy more than silver and gold, because it outlines more clearly than in any other of my books the crisis at the end and how we're to prepare for the second coming of Jesus." But then I hurry on. They are relevant also to us in the practical counsel they contain. And what practical counsel they contain, dear friends? Let me quickly, because what time have I got to finish? Okay, probably I'm past it. I'm past it. I better hurry. Let me just give you one very relevant piece of counsel. To me, it's very relevant today, and it certainly was relevant back there. This is the house where Ellen White had her famous health reform vision. It's over in a little town called Otsego in the state of Michigan. That's the house as it used to be. This is how it is today. You can still see the basic house. We did some filming of Keepers of the Flame here in this house, the house associated with Ellen White's health vision. Is it relevant? Was it relevant back there? You may remember that as a result of that vision given to her on Friday night, June 5th, 1863, out of that vision she was shown many things about our health. And this is one of them. She wrote the following year, "Tobacco is a poison of the most deceitful and malignant kind." Do you know that at that time, friends, doctors were prescribing smoking if you suffered from bronchitis? Imagine that. You suffered from bronchitis, let's smoke. It'll kill the germ. Will it? She said it was a poison of the most deceitful. When you're deceived, you believe something to be right when it's really wrong. And she also said it was malignant, it would cause death. She said it is all the more dangerous because its effects upon the system are so slow and scarcely perceivable. I read recently it takes 20 years to develop a case of lung cancer. Deceived, malignant, slow. It wasn't until 1957, nearly 100 years after that vision, that the American Heart Association concluded that smoking was a causative factor in lung cancer. Look at this. It's hard to see. I wish you could see that picture at the bottom clearly. It's the lungs of somebody who died of emphysema. Your lungs should be a beautiful pink. Why are those lungs black and blocked? Because of the effects of the tar from tobacco smoke collecting in a person's lungs. And when you die of emphysema, you can't breathe. You can't breathe. These statistics I got from the internet. Deaths from lung cancer in the United States, 1954, 20,000. 1984, 121,000. Deaths worldwide from the effects of smoking, 2005, 5,400,000. By 2030, 8,300,000 people will die in 1 year. Did Ellen White know what she talked about? Was it relevant back there? Is it relevant today? I believe so, dear friends. Look at this very quickly. This is a study that was done way back in the 1950s and 60s. It's recently been repeated just this last year, and the results are being released. But if you look at the purple line, that's representing Californian population generally, just the general population. What follows is how much people who are Adventists don't suffer from these diseases compared to the Californian average. From lung cancer, 30%. From mouth, throat and larynx cancer, 5%. From bronchitis and emphysema, 32%. From bladder cancer, 28%. From esophageal cancer, 34%. From cirrhosis of the liver, 13%. Dear friends, do you realise what you're looking at is a fulfilment of prophecy showing how relevant Ellen White's counsel is? How much healthier Adventists are compared to the average population. Do we realise what a blessing our health message is? Look at the Adventist longevity study, how long we're living. It says Adventist men live to 8.2 years compared to 73 years of the average Californian population. In other words, look how much extra we're enjoying as life. Nearly 10 years extra life as Adventists. Then Adventist women, 86.3 years compared to 78.8 years. Another 7.5 years. And what about this? Vegetarian Adventist men, we live 12.6 years longer than the average. Is this a blessing? Is this relevance? Oh yes, my friends, just in this one area of health, how relevant it is. Just a year or two ago, the United States News and Family Report, Family Health, issued an article that went to the world. 10 health habits that will help you to live to 100. This is a world paper, a worldwide prestigious paper. And look at number 8. Live like a Seventh-day Adventist. Isn't that wonderful? Live like an Adventist. Americans who define themselves as Seventh-day Adventists have an average life expectancy of 89, about a decade, 10 years longer than the average American. One of the basic tenets of the religion is that it's important to cherish the body that's on loan from God, which means no smoking, alcohol abuse. I won't read the following. Followers typically stick to a vegetarian diet based on fruits, vegetables, beans and nuts, and get plenty of exercise. They're also very focused on family and community. Live like an Adventist, it's saying to the whole world. Why? Because of the counsel, the testimony of Jesus brought to us. The China Study, a book that points out very, very powerfully, recently printed. We now have a deep and broad range of evidence showing that a whole foods, plant-based diet is best for the heart, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, your kidneys, bones, eyes and brains. And then it says this is what is best to not only to preserve our health, but also to treat our health. Well, I must write very quickly. The last one, they are relevant in the way they help us to get to know Jesus better. And dear friends, to me that's the supreme reason. Read Desire of Ages. Read. If you haven't read it sometime. Resolve today during this camp that you're going to read first of all Steps to Christ if you haven't read it. Desire of Ages on the life of Jesus. It will draw you closer to Jesus. I know it will. And I'm just so profoundly thankful that the Lord has given us this gift to remind us that one day we want to live together in heaven in a world that's wonderfully new. Do you know Ellen White wrote this? The glory of the eternal world has been opened before me in vision. And I want to tell you that heaven is worth winning. If you could get one glimpse into the glories of that place, and Ellen White did in vision, you would not count any loss too great if you would only walk its streets of transparent gold and sing the song of triumph with the white-robed company of heaven. Dear brethren and sisters, whom I've learned to love during this camp, I just commend to you to have that hope in your hearts. Jesus has died to save each one of us. He's given us this wonderful gift that might draw us closer to the Word and closer to Jesus, the centre of this Word. It's certainly my prayer that you will come to appreciate this gift. Read it. That's the way to appreciate it. And it will help you to have an abundant entrance into the kingdom. Never to replace the Bible, my friends. Never. But as an addition, God in His love has given you this because it is relevant to our needs and above all else our need of Jesus. Let's bow our heads in a word of prayer. Our loving Father in heaven, we thank you today that in your great love for your people, as we live in this very confused time when so many events are happening that are preparing the world for the coming of Jesus, Lord, I just thank you for this gift. Never to replace the word which you gave so long ago, because it alone can guide us into the kingdom. But you have given us so much extra instruction that is so relevant to the world in which we live today, to help us so that we can lay aside every weight of sin that so easily besets us and keep directing us to Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. May we appreciate this gift, and may, above all else, we learn to love Jesus, the centre of that gift, more and more each day. And I pray this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.